भरोसा सिर्फ पहचान नहीं। मैक्स न्यूयॉर्क लाइफ अब है मैक्स लाइफ इंश्योरेंस।
Welcome back to Your World at 10 and welcome to the new geopolitics of food scarcity. As food supplies tighten, we're moving into a new food era, one in which it is every country for itself. Those are the words of Lester Brown, president of the Earth Policy Institute. Now, Mr. Brown's dire forecast has been prompted by the severe drought conditions across the world this year, more markedly in the US, the world's leading producer and exporter of corn. The US is currently facing what is being estimated as the worst drought in 50 years. It has imperiled more than half the crop there and doubled corn prices in the States. The heat wave in Europe is hurting corn on the continent as well as other agri commodities. China, India, Korea, Australia, they're all experiencing conditions ranging from below normal rain to drought-like conditions. So what does this mean for food supply and prices? Well, to talk about that, I have with me Kona Haque, Head of Agricultural Commodities Research at Macquarie. Kona, thank you very much for joining me. Let me start by asking you how bad it is in terms of the drought-like situation that the world is facing and whether you would characterize it as one of the worst that you have seen.
Well, certainly the drought that's being experienced in the USA right now, yes, that is considered to be one of the worst in 50 years. And in particular, it's hitting the corn belt, that crucial corn and soybean growing belt in the Midwestern states. That is an area which right now, at this moment in time, is really, really devoid of moisture. And the forecasts right now are not so great. There's a little bit of rains due, but I don't think it's going to come in time in terms of recovering some of the damage that's already been done. So we are expecting to see yields drop significantly below what they could have been.
All right, but that's just the picture in the US. What about outside of the US, Kona?
So we've also had drought-like conditions in Russia, in particular southern Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan. So these regions experienced very dry conditions earlier in spring during the planting season, which basically meant that the crop didn't get off to a very good start. We've had some soil moisture replenished since then, but again, a lot of damage has already been done. So that's one area we need to be keeping an eye at, because as you know, the former Soviet Union as an area is a very major grain exporting region. And what's really concerning there is that if you remember in 2010 when they had that massive drought in Russia, they weren't averse to imposing export embargoes. So if any of such an event were to take place, that could have a worse impact on global supplies. So that's Russia. And India. India's monsoons have also been slower and more delayed than normal. We're roughly about about 40 to 25% below average, what it should be. Certainly some of the sugarcane areas have been impacted in the north and northwest and the southern states. And also cotton areas like Gujarat, they're looking particularly dry, and area planted will probably be down quite a bit there. We believe that also just generally, sowing for the crops as a whole is falling roughly a quarter behind what they should be.
All right, we haven't touched upon Europe, and news reports indicate that the corn crop in Europe is also under threat.
So Europe is a bit of a mixed picture. You've got very wet northern Europe, the UK, Germany, these areas have been very wet. But on the other hand, Spain and just southern Europe as a whole has been extraordinarily dry. As a whole, we believe that it's not as bad as maybe it could have been. We have had some variable rains coming in the last few weeks. So it's not going to be as a damaging outlook as what we're seeing in the US, for example.
So you've given us a mental map of the geographic regions and how they've been affected. Let's go through some of the worst hit commodities. So corn, clearly, as you've spoken about. Soybean is what I understand. Wheat as well. You refer to the former Soviet Union regions. Are these some of the worst impacted agricultural commodities in your assessment?
It is. So what we do is we look at it from a global supply-demand balance point of view, and in particular we look at the level of inventories. And what we see is that even before we came into the current crop development phase, inventories were running very low already for corn and soybeans. So now with the drought and the impact of a potential harvest destruction, that's going to mean that we've lost a big opportunity to replenish those inventories. So essentially what we're saying is that the supply-demand balance is going to tighten significantly more. So I think essentially we're looking at higher prices to come, because what we have to now see is that both corn and soybeans, because we do not have enough supply, we're going to have to see prices edge up considerably higher and to be sustained at high levels for a while still, just to ration demand. The situation in wheat is a little bit different. We already have decent inventories from the previous 2 seasons where we had pretty good supply. But earlier this year in the FSU, the drought in FSU and Europe, we have got some cause for concerns for the quality wheats. I think that supply is still looking very scant. So wheat is beginning to look a little bit more tight than it had been. But overall, it's corn and soybean that really, as commodities, are the tightest right now.
How much higher are prices likely to go? Because we've already seen in the case of corn, I'm told, prices are almost double or more than double in the US. What about the rest of the pack that we've discussed and where prices will head from here?
So what we're expecting is that prices for corn and soybeans are going to have to stay at elevated levels for much of the next 5 to 6 months. And the reason for that is the next available supplies will not be due until next March maybe, which is when the Brazilians and the Argentinians go to harvest. So we need really high prices to incentivize farmers in those Latin American countries to really expand acres, to apply husbandry and fertilizers and irrigation to make sure that they have a bumper crop. That will be due later in March and will provide some supply relief. But the other reason why prices are going to have to stay high for the next 5 to 6 months is because we need to ration demand, as I mentioned. So some of the end-use sectors, like for corn, for example, ethanol or livestock feed, these have to be these industries will need to start hurting in order to stop using more corn, or you're going to have to start substituting into alternatives. But it's not an easy process. It's very sticky and it does take time, and this is why we believe that we're looking for at least another 5 or 6 months of elevated prices.
I assume that's the story with wheat as well. I'm told wheat prices are currently trading at one of their highest levels in the last 3 to 4 years, Kona?
And so wheat will naturally follow corn because they trade, they're substitutes for each other, and both on the supply side they compete for the acreage, and on the demand side they compete for feed use. So wheat typically does tend to follow corn. Any loss in livestock feed demand that cannot be met by corn will automatically go into wheat, and so wheat supplies will therefore need to be a lot higher, or demand will have to be rationed. And then there is this concern that if there is any particular shortfall coming out of the FSU, if they were to impose some kind of ban, that could restrict supplies even further. And as we saw again in 2010, you did see a lot of net food importing countries, grain importers like the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, they do tend to panic buy and hoard during these times of sensitivities. You don't want a repeat of the food riots that we saw in the last few years, so governments will be keen to ensure that they have all their supplies and they've got it on their shores rather than having to buy them later at higher prices. So a combination of all these impacts will ultimately lead to a concern that wheat will probably have to end up rising in tangent with corn and soybeans.
All right, can I have time for just one quick last question? I guess this is the most important question. In India, they're estimating that if we do in fact experience full drought-like conditions, it could shave off about 0.5% of GDP growth. What impact do you think this food supply and prices situation is going to have on global GDP growth?
Well, you're going to see food inflation. Now, typically there is a lag. It's not instant. Depending on where you're on the food chain, it could be a three-month lag. Unfortunately, the developing countries will be feeling it more than, say, the developed countries, because more of their purchasing power and expenditure is spent on food items. So unfortunately, these countries will have to endure higher food inflation and ultimately inflation. The disposable incomes will be lower. It could have an impact on the global economy, but in the bigger scheme of things, when you look at what's happening in the European economic crisis and the US still slow and China still looking like it might slow as well, there are quite a few deflationary pressures there as well. Crude oil is not at the highs of 120 that we'd seen only a few months ago, and when you draw comparisons to the current potential food price spike to that of 2007-08, there are a lot of differences. This time round we have a much bigger rice supply. I don't think the economy is as strong as it was back then to sustain a continuous rally, because demand at some point will get destroyed. So there are a few differences. I wouldn't necessarily get into panic at this stage.
All right, and we do have a big, at least from an India point of view, a record buffer stock here in India. Let's see how much that helps in mitigating the situation. Kona, thank you very much. We're out of time. That's Kona Haque of Macquarie. They're taking you through the rather grim food supply and prices situation. With that, it's a wrap. Coming up next is Markets Today.